2 hours ago in Tokyo, on the Rainbow Bridge, a blue truck and a car from the International Hunters Association were moving along, overtaking other cars. In the car, Grant asked the girl next to her, "How many times have you come to Korea?" Aries replied, "Twice." Grant asked, "You said this was your mother's hometown, right?" Aries said, "It was my mother's homeland, but not mine." Someone's voice from the front seat asked, "The long sword exhibition will end in Korea, right? Did you apply for a vacation?" The driver of the car said, "Yeah, there was something he wanted to find in the Korean dungeons." Grant, with satisfaction, said, "I hope he finds what he's looking for." Then, the truck driver said on the radio, "Communication will be disconnected due to electromagnetic waves from the dungeon." Blue crystals appeared around the car. Grant looked out of the window and asked in surprise, "The dungeon is right above the sea. Isn't that romantic?" Aries told him not to talk nonsense, and if the dungeon collapsed, it would be a disaster. Meanwhile, at the entrance of the Rainbow Bridge dungeon, Shindasuru, a member of the Great Sage Guild, yawned and said how boring it was to manage the entrance to the dungeon. The guy looked at him and said, "It was quite difficult to manage here until 3 weeks ago." Suddenly, an unknown thing hit Satoru's leg. He looked at it questioningly and said, "It's a slime. It's way cuter than those in the dungeon." Satoru turned and asked, "Is it okay for them to be outside of the dungeon?" The guy in armor said fearfully, "Of course not, you idiot." Suddenly, something pressed against his back. The armor guy turned back and saw a large troll monster. Currently, in the building of the Hunter Association, Haruto was looking at his stats with satisfaction and said, "Great, all his stats have increased. A little bit more, and he will reach level 50. When a hunter reaches level 50, it is easier for him to join hunting parties. Usually, in mid-level dungeons, the monsters are just about the same level, which helps hunters grow faster, and you can get reward items. Sometimes you even find rare ones." Haruto said, "Now, I would make copies of the rods of the giant spider and try to sell them at the auction." Suddenly, Haruto heard noise from behind, turned back, and saw some people running worriedly and asking to make way because there was a dungeon collapse somewhere. Haruto watched in surprise and thought, could it be a dungeon break? The guy with the cap on his head asked, "But why were they sending us there before the big guilds?" The man in uniform said that the truck with the legendary sword was caught up in this, so a request for help was received from the International Hunter Association. Haruto thought with horror, "Hold on. The long sword of the Clasia dragon was caught up in a dungeon break." Meanwhile, several airships were standing on the roof of the Hunter Association building. The man in the armor suit asked, "Quickly request help from other guilds. Our top priority is to protect the truck with the legendary sword." Someone's voice said, "What nonsense? Who gave this order? I am the team leader, and I will be giving orders." Hang Ji-young said, "Our top priorities are to destroy the monsters and rescue the civilians. It's an emergency, so we will discuss your order later." Suddenly, Ji-young noticed in the distance how someone was trying to break through to the ship. She shouted, "They are in a rush. Hurry up, all of you. Get on." Haruto raised his hand and asked Mrs. Ji-young to let him go with her. He also wanted to help. She was surprised to see Haruto. Then Haruto shouted, "I would go too. If I can't fight the monsters, I would help evacuate the citizens. In such a situation, any help would be useful." After a while, the airships flew to the Rainbow Bridge. Ji-young said, in the dungeon, he also managed to save his comrade, and now he wants to help evacuate the civilians. "Aren't you called a hero?" Haruto smiled fakely and thought that he came here purely for selfish reasons. The guy in armor asked in surprise, "Isn't that strange? Only 3 weeks have passed since we finished stabilizing the Rainbow Bridge dungeon." Ji-young stood in the middle of the ship and said, "Anything could happen in our world, including another dungeon breach. And no matter how many times it happened, We would go to the epicenter each time to prevent the great disaster of 15 years ago. Haruto thought. The great disaster happened 15 years ago. Simultaneous dungeon outbreaks all over the world. If the monsters in the dungeon are not exterminated in sufficient numbers, the dungeon overflows and collapses, forming an outbreak of the monsters. My parents died in that disaster. He had never told anyone about this before, and no one would believe him. But on that day, a supernatural being from another dimension appeared and cursed him with this ability. A magic circle appeared and pierced his heart with magic. That being called this curse a gift and said one thing. 20 years. He didn't know if it meant the duration of the ability or his lifespan, but the hourglass of the curse continues to tick even now as a tattoo on his neck. Haruto remembered that back then, that creature appeared through a great catastrophe. It might mean when it appears again, another cataclysm will happen. He has 5 years left, and now he knows how to develop his abilities and become the strongest hunter. Perhaps he will be able to prevent the catastrophe and lift the curse. Meanwhile, an explosion occurred on the Rainbow Bridge. The enraged monster overturned cars on nearby people. Hunters attacked the green monster from all sides, while Satoru was watching and thought that there were too few hunters. They won't be able to protect all the civilians. Suddenly, he noticed a monster running toward him, but he easily cut it with his sword. But another monster appeared behind Satoru, who tried to attack, but a dagger pierced the monster. The guy said with displeasure, "You should not get distracted." Satoru thanked the guy for his help, but the guy in armor warned him that if Satoru let his guard down again, he would not help him. Satoru asked him, "Is there any news of reinforcements?" The guy in armor said that due to the electromagnetic waves of the dungeon, they cannot contact them, but they probably already know about the situation and are on their way here. We should also run to the beginning of the bridge, that way they will meet up with reinforcements faster. Meanwhile, the Bearmon King monster attacking the truck. Gran asked Ares, "Are you sure the truck will be okay?" Ares held a magic ball in her hand and said that she understood his concerns and asked him to rest assured. Her defensive magic was top-notch. Even a level 400 monster couldn't scratch it. Suddenly, the Rainbow Bridge began to collapse. Ares worriedly said, "Even the strongest defensive magic wouldn't protect against something like that." Then, the airship approached the battlefield, and the guy in uniform looked out the window in surprise. A large red monster appeared from the water. Jiyoung said that it was the boss of the Rainbow Bridge dungeon, Kueshi. She shouted sharply for everyone to prepare for the attack, but the monster opened its mouth and began to attack the airships. Haruto angrily thought that this monster destroyed the bridge. He hoped that his long sword was safe.